Alex Garland's Civil War has been surrounded by controversy since before its release. But in a strange way, a lot of that controversy proves the movie's point. Many have criticized it for being apolitical, but an honest assessment finds the opposite. It might be a little vague about the precise steps that bring America to the boiling point, but it's specific enough. The president has become a tyrant. He stomped over the 22nd Amendment for a third term. He disbanded the FBI, removing one of the checks on his power, and he kills his own citizens. This answers the biggest question from the movie's first trailer. How do California and Texas end up on the same side of the Civil War? The answer? To stop a threat much bigger than their political disagreements. Is that an apolitical stance? Not really. Garland is taking a precise position. He is saying the left and right have different ideas for the most efficacious way to run the country, but they should share at least one common cause: upholding a system that is meant to divide power and prevent the rise of a tyrant. If the response to that is pick a side, it says we are so polarized, we cannot even bring ourselves to admit there's at least one thing we agree on, one of the basic tenets of Western civilization. We choose not to be ruled by tyranny. This unwillingness to agree, and unwillingness to have conversations across political divides, is exactly what Civil War is warning against, and that stubbornness is part of the engine driving the controversy. If Garland had picked a side and used this movie as a bludgeon against the left or right, he would accomplish the opposite of his stated goal. He would only feed into the exact polarization he's trying to push against, and ultimately just preach to whichever choir agrees with him. The movie attempts to avoid that polarization in a couple of ways. One, by leaving the exact steps which get us here vague, so it's harder for the audience to place blame or identify with a side. And two, by focusing on war photographers as the protagonists. These characters are attempting to be objective observers, just taking photos without intervening. If we can identify with them, we also become impartial observers, and that accomplishes another goal: crafting a truly anti-war film. One of Garland's fears in making a war movie was that in pursuit of being anti-war, it's easy to accidentally accomplish the opposite. Most war movies contain moments of drama and heroism which can romanticize it. Most contain a camaraderie that forms when you watch a group of soldiers trudge through hell together, which means leaving the movie with mixed emotions. But for Civil War, Garland wants the audience to leave with a very precise emotion: revulsion. And when you step outside of a war, by following impartial photographers instead of soldiers, revulsion is exactly what you feel. Every death feels senseless and disgusting. To further this point, Garland also avoided romanticizing death. There are no final words, dramatic slow motion, or buckets of bright red blood. Instead, people die unremarkably. One moment they're alive, then they fall, and they're dead. It's awful, and it's viscerally off-putting. There's one sequence where the journalists camp outside a mall. It's the night before Jesse's first time in a true war zone. The transition from night to day is jarring. One moment it's quiet, then suddenly jump cut to gunfire, skipping right to Jesse's first foray into battle. Many in the audience at my theater jumped in their seats. It might seem like a cheap jump scare, but it accomplishes something. It reminds you that war is loud and ensures you feel negatively toward it. Gunfire is an unwelcome and unpleasant intrusion, one more step in dismantling any romanticism about it. And of course, it's hard to feel anything but repulsed at the final sequence. We've seen American landmarks destroyed on film many times before, but typically it's done by some external enemy: aliens, monsters, or natural disasters. But in this movie, we watch uniformed American soldiers, heroes in so many other movies, blow up the Lincoln Memorial, and we watch them execute the unarmed President of the United States. It's a scene that makes you sick to your stomach. It's revolting enough, it even gets through Lee Smith's tough exterior. Throughout the movie, she's presented as war-weary and immune to atrocity because she's seen it all. Having her be the one to break down in that final sequence, crying for the first time that we've seen, helps to ensure we feel what Garland wants us to feel. In some sense, all of this might seem idealistic or childish. Do we really need someone to tell us war is bad? Well, there are different kinds of war. There are defensive wars, and I doubt Garland is opposed to a country defending itself from an aggressor. There are civil wars, which are fought over specific ideas, where you can argue over which side is right. And there's another kind of civil war, the kind Garland is afraid of. He mentions America's first Civil War.
America has a history of a civil war that was very, very delineated over a very clear issue of slavery. And so that creates a concept of civil war in the mind.
And then he describes the other kind, saying how many wars today don't have such an easy delineation.
And there are other kinds of civil wars which happen a lot in the world at the moment, which are really just a fracturing and a factionalization into competing angry groups in localized areas.
His belief is that civil war can be fueled by anger as much as ideas, something Garland has clearly been grappling with for years. Just look at the theme of rage in 28 Days Later, which I covered in my last video in this series. If emotion can bring us to war, maybe emotion can stop us too. So Garland is not just saying war is bad, he is making us feel repulsed at the idea of it. Much like Nolan using Oppenheimer to reinforce a fear of nuclear weapons proliferation, Garland reinforces a fear of civil war, while degrading any romance we might attach to the idea. Civil war is neighbors killing neighbors. Think of the scene where they come upon two soldiers strung up and bleeding out. One of the men with guns, part of the group who captured the soldiers, went to high school with one of them. They weren't friends, but they knew each other. Now, he has him hanging by his wrists while he debates, kill him now or torture him for a while. Civil war is opening the floodgates to extremists. Think of Jesse Plemons' character who asks, "What kind of American are you?" and shoots you for the wrong answer. That scene ends with an unforgettable image of Kaylee Spaney's character climbing over a pile of bodies to escape a mass grave. That's the image Garland wants you to remember when you encounter extremists. War is bad is not a complicated idea, but if properly visualized, it is a powerful one, worth reinforcing. As society polarizes, and it becomes increasingly difficult to have conversations, it's an idea that becomes paramount, because if it's strong enough, it could be the thing which tells us maybe a conversation is worth one more try before those who feel unheard turn to someone willing to listen, someone promising to return their voice through brute force. Today, Garland's experience is that on social media or in public discourse, opinions and disagreements are extreme, but in everyday conversation, people can talk despite political disagreements. However, he sees things getting worse and wants us to be terrified of the consequences should that polarization reach a boiling point, should it come offline and invade real-life conversation too. And I believe he achieves that with this movie. His other goal is one he talked about explicitly before the movie's release, pushing back on the demonization of journalists. In the 2020s, accusations of bias or outright manipulation of narratives might be at an all-time high. Many have lost respect for journalists, or more than that, see them as outright malicious. I haven't heard Garland discuss his thoughts on how much of that is unfair versus how much is deserved, and I don't see it in the subtext of this movie. But his point is that we need journalists, the same way we need doctors. That's not a new idea. Of course, without some form of journalism, without people going to dangerous places and reporting what they see, the public would be in the dark or at the mercy of governmental propaganda. Just like war is bad, Garland doesn't spend much of the movie making these arguments explicit. Instead, he works on an emotional level while pointing us in a direction to make our own inferences. Because, of course, if he can make us think, and we arrive at the ideas ourselves, our minds will more readily embrace them. The closest we get to a discussion on the purpose of journalism is in Kirsten Dunst's character Lee Smith's existential crisis. She thought her photos were warning people, but it seems those warnings fell on deaf ears because the US has fallen into civil war. Now we know the rest of the movie, she's putting herself in danger to do a job, but is no longer sure exactly why. But by the end, it seems she has decided it's important. Important enough to die for. Throughout the movie, Lee Smith is presented as one of the best and most renowned in her field. Jessie is presented as the up-and-coming new generation. We're told that she is like a young Lee. In the end, Lee doesn't just die in the line of duty. She specifically dies protecting Jessie. She died protecting the new generation of journalists. It's a job so important. It's worth dying to ensure someone will be around to do it. And if the movie makes us feel that, it may lead us to think about why it's important. Even if it's not a new thought, but simply a reflection on something we already know, but perhaps have forgotten in this polarized moment in history, if we remember and we feel, then the idea is reinforced. One way Garland could have tried to reinstate trust in journalists is by making them heroes. He could have made them principled, unwavering characters who do everything for the right reasons. But that isn't what we see. Sometimes it seems like these characters are just looking for the adrenaline rush of getting the perfect shot and getting it before anyone else. Just look at Joel's smile whenever he's in the middle of the action. Or look at Jessie's recklessness, pushing things too far to get that shot, putting herself in the crosshairs where Lee died to save her. These actions can make you frustrated with the characters, and they make it clear they are not heroes. But they are human, and that's what Garland is trying to accomplish. If he tried to idealize them, we would automatically bristle at the story because it would ring false. It would have no chance of changing the way we feel. So he is not trying to idealize them. He is trying to humanize them. That at least increases the likelihood we'll pay attention with an open mind. Then he can push back. And he does. The primary accusation against the press today is that they don't do their job. Where they should be impartial observers, they instead take sides and use journalism to manipulate. They pick and choose what to report, leave out or add context depending on what best sells their message, or maybe even outright lie. This is one area where Garland's characters do not falter. We see they have a genuine desire to be impartial. They are only here to document, even if it kills them. The characters do have mixed motivations, which speaks to why they do the job, but it doesn't change the fact that they are doing it. Think of it this way. If you were going into surgery, would it bother you to know the surgeon enjoys their job? Would you lose faith in the profession if they weren't doing this out of kindness or some higher moral calling, but instead because they enjoy the challenge and sense of accomplishment? Garland's characters are flawed and complicated, but in the area where people are most concerned about journalists today, they push back. They push back in their actions, and Garland pushes back with the grammar of the movie. Simply by making journalists protagonists, he asks us to identify and empathize with them. And though they aren't superheroes, the few moments of heroism, the sort we'd normally see from soldiers in a war movie, are instead attributed to these journalists. When Jesse Plemons' character threatens to shoot Joel, there's a great moment of rescue out of an action movie when Sammy crashes through him with their van. It's also a moment of self-sacrifice because it gets Sammy killed. And of course, there's Lee's heroic sacrifice. There's also the film's visual language. Garland purposefully had Jessie use traditional camera equipment to develop her photos the old-fashioned way, because this connects their work to another time. It reminds us of decades ago, when photojournalists might have been held in higher regard, At every moment in this movie, when characters snap a photo, and the movie shows us that photo in black and white, we think of a photo taken by old-fashioned journalists, as opposed to HD videos and the sort of footage that would make us think of contemporary journalism, who are the subject of so much animus. And if nothing else, this movie at least underscores the cost of war photography. Putting all the ideas aside, this movie works as a thrill ride. As always, Garland writes likable characters who are easy to identify with. He places them in a world that feels grounded, so when they face danger, we feel the appropriate suspense. I can't tell you how tense my theater was when Jesse jumped from one car to another, and then that car went missing. These characters constantly put themselves through hell. We see the effects on Jessie, vomiting after her encounter in the "What kind of American are you" scene. And of course, Lee Smith is a look at her future, war-weary, cynical, and nightly flashbacks to the worst atrocities. Then, of course, there is death itself, as Sammy, Lee, and others don't make it out alive. If Garland is successful in reminding us, on a feeling level, the price paid by journalists to show us the truth in wartime, perhaps we'll be compelled to pay more attention. Historically, we've seen photos enter the public consciousness and become iconic. There's the Napalm Girl photo from the Vietnam War. I won't show it here, but it's a famous photo depicting a 9-year-old girl running naked after ripping burning clothes off from a napalm attack. Claims that it helped bring the war to an end seem to be exaggerated, but nonetheless, it has become a symbol, something scorched into the minds of those who see it, a shortcut for our hearts to recall the horror of war. Garland tried to leave us with his own symbol. As Lee is shot, Jessie snaps her photo. The final sequence moves quickly, and of course I remember the broad strokes, but many of the details are fuzzy. What is not fuzzy, what is crystal clear in my mind, is that black and white photo of Lee Smith dying her senseless death. Pictures and videos have become frivolous today because we no longer have to remember to carry cameras, buy film, or get photos developed. Instead, we have phones on us at all times. But like Jesse's film equipment, showing us a still, black and white image conjures the value we used to attach to physical photos. And in this context, it conjures the idea of those iconic war photos that sank into the public consciousness. Leaving this movie, now we have a symbol, a shortcut in our minds to remember the cost and sacrifice of journalists who choose to enter a war zone. Are all journalists pure of heart? Are none biased or corrupt? Of course not. As always, the truth is a mix between the extremes. Some of the distrust is earned, and some is exaggerated. But none of this changes Garland's primary truth, that the profession is necessary and important. If the movie is successful, it'll remind the public to try and find that trust again. And it will remind the press the ideals they should be striving for to earn that trust again. The movie ends on another iconic photo, the U.S. president lying dead in front of the soldiers who executed him. It's a sickening, haunting photo, and one that I'll think of every time I sense that polarization Garland talks about. When I see a disagreement over how the government should be run morph into an existential battle between two extremes, fueled by anger and hate, I will remember that photo, and I'll feel repulsed. I think we can wrap it up there. A movie called Civil War, released in a particularly polarized election year, is of course inviting controversy. To try and push back against it without feeding into it means threading an impossibly fine needle. If anyone can do it, it's Alex Garland, and in my view, he succeeded. To me, this was a thrill ride of a story with a powerful message underneath it all, but I would love to hear what you thought. So in the comments, make sure to let me know how you enjoyed the movie, whether or not it resonated, and what it meant to you. Also, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out What 28 Days Later is really about, an analysis of one of my favorite movies written by Garland. And I'll likely be covering more of his work too, because I'm a huge fan. So make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.